duck back with another war story. This one is a 2010 F-150, and we're going to call it the Alternator Eater. It all started out with a text message asking me to come and program a PCM for this truck. I asked for more information about why we're replacing the PCM, and they told me that it was due to the fact that the PCM was not commanding the alternator to charge. So the reason why I'm calling it the Alternator Eater is because the alternator, the battery, and the positive cable were all replaced in September of 23. And then it came back in May of 24 and they replaced the alternator again. Then in July of 24, we're still not charging. Now, I was very skeptical of replacing the PCM for an alternator not charging. But in today's systems, they have this stuff called smart charging, where it's not always charging the battery, and the PCM will send out a request or a command to ask the alternator to charge, and when it's not in need, it won't charge. So you really have to have a really good understanding of these charging systems. And the thing about it is that every manufacturer is different. So I will tell you that I wasted a lot of time on this one based off of the fact of not knowing how Ford alternator systems actually worked, and also not doing my due diligence in doing a thorough visual inspection. So the customer asked for the PCM to be replaced and programmed. So that's what I did. Do you want to guess what happened after I did that? It still was not charging. So I informed the shop owner of the situation, that the alternator was still not charging, and asked him if he wanted me to actually diag the vehicle. And of course he said yes. And this is when the can of worms started just pouring out. Anytime that you have to go behind other people to do a diag, rule of thumb, start from scratch. No matter if it's the best tech in the world or anybody. Start from scratch, use your testing methods to come up with a conclusion. And let me reinforce the power of a great visual inspection. If I did a good visual inspection, I would have been done the very first day. To be honest, I probably have 7 hours in this one diag when it could have been figured out in 30 minutes. Okay, so whenever I am faced with diagnostics, rule of thumb, I always do a full health scan. That way I can verify what's there before I start, and I can see what's there when I get done. It's a way of covering myself. If we look at the DTC chart, we see that we have 2 codes stored in the PCM for the generator control circuit. If you look at the last 2 digits, those are going to be manufacturer codes. That's what's going to separate whatever from whatever. The funny thing is once you type in the P0620 and Ford service information, you're going to be hit with pinpoint test C. So I'm not a big fan of manufacturer flowcharts. I try to figure out a way to just use them as a guide. Um, if not, you'll be there forever. And in this case, I was there forever anyway. But what you're seeing is the actual pigtail of the alternator connector. They informed me that they replaced the connector for some reason, but I seen it And anytime that you see butt connectors, you should take a second and verify that things are hooked up correctly. Now, if you look closely, you'll see that the actual blue and orange and the violet wires are switched. When they wired in the new pigtail, they got these two crossed. And that kind of concerned me since we just replaced the PCM. But these are low voltage circuits, so they're not going to hurt anything. So Gen Com and Gen Mon is the two wires that were crossed. So I fixed those two, and uh, we had like a 13.2, 13.5 output from the alternator. And after that, I thought I was okay. I thought it was charging. Okay, so this is why it's so important to actually have a really good understanding of how these systems work. If we read, this is, I forget where this is at, theory and operation of the charging system, but it's hidden somewhere else. Um, so we see that these lines that were crossed are pulse width modulation, so a square wave. The generator communication GenCom line communicates the desired set point from the PCM to the voltage regulator. So that's going to be the command from the PCM to the actual alternator. The generator monitor GenMon line communicates generator load and error conditions to the PCM. So the GenMon line is what actually told the PCM to set the faults that we had seen. So this right here is what's going to crack the case. And to be honest with you, I didn't use this to figure this out. I actually YouTubed a different video and somebody else explained it to me so I could figure it out. Like I said, this portion is actually hidden, but it's theory and operation. Um, you gotta read that stuff nowadays, guys. If you don't read it, you're wasting your time. So the very next day, I spent the majority of the day learning about the system, just wrapping my head around how this actually worked. Um, on the screen is a oscilloscope capture of the GenMon and the GemCon. I want to say that the red trace is going to be the GemCon, and the blue trace will be the GemMon. Now, looking at the waveform, the red trace is attempting to try to charge, and then it stops. And then we see that it repeats itself. We see that the GenMon trace is doing its square wave and it's attempting to communicate back to the PCM. And then eventually it says, we're not seeing what we want to see, and it just stops. So we're definitely not seeing the correct wave patterns for an alternator to properly charge. One good thing about using this test is that we have proven out circuit integrity for the GenMon and the GenCon unit, so we don't have to actually worry about the wires from the PCM to the alternator connector. So at this point, I know it's not the alternator. It puts out 13.5. The 13.5 is a default strategy whenever the GenMon and the GenCon are not correlating. It's not working correctly. The wiring from the PCM to the alternator connector is good. We verify that with the oscilloscope test. So now I'm just pulling my hair out. I start voltage dropping tests from the battery to the alternator to the fuse box, just trying to get some kind of direction. All right, so now I go back to the wiring diagram. Everything on the side of the connector the actual connector at the alternator is good. We've already proven that out. We know the alternator can produce. We know the PCM is trying to command. It's just not doing its job, right? The only thing left is the actual hot side, the B plus terminal that runs off of the alternator to the battery. So we know that the wire from the alternator to the PCM is good. Wire from the alternator to the PCM is good. All there's left is this B plus terminal. The red one is fine. I did check with voltage drop, this fusible link, this one, and this one. They're all good. So these all run back to the battery. Off the battery, we go to power distribution, which is probably going to be your fuse box. And then we also run off to a starter motor. So let's assume that everything from here to the starter is fine. So all of this is interconnected. What's left are ground side circuits. So if we look right here, we have G108, G106, and G107. The good thing about service information, it tells us location view, right hand engine compartment. That one was easy to test. G107, right front engine compartment. And we'll click on these. So G107, G108, we load tested both of these with a test light, and they both were good to go. What's left? G106. On right bottom of engine. This is where I wish I would have spent more time doing the visual inspection. So this is G106. They claim to have no knowledge of why this ground would be loose. But this is the reason why the alternator was not charging. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see that the ground terminal has been arcing on and off. I don't have any idea of how long it's been doing this, but this is what killed all the alternators. So after finding a correct nut to put on that ground and make sure it was nice and tight, this is the waveform pattern that we actually have. If you see, we have the pulse width modulation pattern that is described in the service info. And now we have a charging system that is producing 14.2 to 14.5 volts, depending on what the system requires. So there it is. The Alternator Eater has been resolved, and it was due to a loose ground. I still don't know why that ground was loose like that. There was no nut on it at all. Unfortunately, sometimes customers don't know or remember what they had done, and not every professional takes pride in their job. Uh, this is this is a mistake done by somebody else that cost his customer some money. It cost the shop that I did this repair for some money, and it cost me a lot of time. Like I said, if I would have just done a thorough visual inspection, I would have saved myself a lot of time and a lot of headache. Um, but it was simple as that. And honestly, if we're looking at that first wave pattern, we can see how the ripple effect is happening. It looks like a bad ground. And that's something that will come with more usage of using a scope. Um, I don't know, man. It's fixed. Background.